Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us as we continue our journey through the Daodejing. And we are currently in chapter 73. And I'll go ahead and get started here. So we're using a different translation today. And I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce the last name here. I think it's Kamjafi, but I'm not sure. Um,
Seems right.
yeah. So this guy's pretty well respected, it seems, in the industry, so to speak. He tends to focus a lot on more of the personal development side of things and potentially more of a religious interpretation of the Tao Te Ching. Although what I've coming to find is a lot of people who are really advocating for a religious interpretation of the Tao Te Ching. Really, it's more of a personal development focus more so than what we would think of in terms of religion. Um, and the other thing that's kind of interesting, if you ever read any of his stuff, is he uses a strange language framework for talking about it. So he talks about things like theology and soteriology and terms that are very religious, but come from a context that's very even within the context of religious Taoism, doesn't really make sense. So I'm a little confused why they went that direction, but we're just going to run with it today. I thought he did a pretty good job with this translation, especially with the final line is really why I picked it. So we'll just kind of step through it here. So bravery, and the word that he's translating as bravery here, previously when we've looked at it, was translated as courage. So I just want us to keep that in mind because it's going to come into play here in terms of some previous context. So bravery or courage in daring, another way daring can be translated frequently is presuming. So courage and presuming results in killing. Now, before we can kind of dive into that too much, we need to see the flip side. Bravery or courage in not daring or presuming results in living. So it's creating, again, a polarity here, and it has some results that are associated with it. So maybe we'll start with what are your thoughts on what is trying to be said with these two statements? In other words, what would bravery or courage with or without the idea of daring or presuming what is the idea that they're getting at here that results in either killing or living?
Well, what it suggests to me, maybe not in a literal way, but at least it suggests it is the idea that we typically associate bravery with things like acts of bravery in battle. We, I mean, or another way to think of it is, we think of members of the military or soldiers, warriors, whatever, as heroes because uh, they put themselves at risk to protect us from enemies, which involves fighting and killing. But there's also the bravery of other types of first responders, medics, and rescuers, and people who are putting themselves at risk to save others, but not by fighting and killing. So there's the idea of bravery in combat, and then there's the idea of bravery in situations where the enemy isn't other people that you have to kill, but it's disasters or forces of nature or whatever.
Okay, so if we look at those two ways of thinking about this bravery or courage, how would you, keeping those similar frameworks, weave in the concept of either daring or presuming within that? How would you fit that in?
Well, presuming is a strange. Uh, I'm not sure how how that fits in, but um, daring seems to kind of go hand in hand with bravery. It means being willing to put oneself at risk, which is they seem to be pretty closely related.
So in the second line here, we have the idea of bravery or courage without daring, right? So there's a way that they're seeing this concept of courage or bravery that can be either associated with it or not associated with it. So if we were thinking about your first concept that there's a certain kind of bravery that results in killing, right? But in your case, you didn't say that it results in killing, but it's a bravery to kill in the sense of like going to battle or war. So if you were going to actually engage in the type of bravery or courage that requires you to kill, what does that require you to have in order to go through with that?
So I kind of see this more as daring or presuming is more in the line of being presumptuous. So when I see this, I'm thinking it's saying that you are, if you're courage enough, if you are, and the courage is like, um, not sure the best way to explain it, but your courage in that presumptuousness, which means like you are comfortable towing or crossing that line of what's appropriate or acceptable, which would result in bad things happening, versus if you are not going to cross those lines, it's more likely to result in good things. So to me, it feels more like it's saying the more comfortable you are of being presumptuous, the more likely you are to cause killing, fighting, bad things to happen, versus the more comfortable you are in not doing that is going to give you better results.
Well, we'll hold off on a second on the idea of better because we're assuming that living versus killing is, better. But
True.
we'll setting that aside for the moment. Um, so we have the concept of courage or bravery, but it's executed in two different ways, either with or without the idea of daring or presumption. And in the case where it's executed with presumption, it can result in killing versus without that presumption, it results in living. So there's a there's an idea here that is kind of just below the surface that I'm trying to get at in the sense of and maybe we'll just kind of talk about it here, is the idea of confidence. So if you are going to kill somebody, uh, you have to have a certain degree of confidence that this is the right thing to do, right? Unless you're like a complete like psychopath or something like that. But a typical person has to have a certain level of confidence, which is what's getting at here with this idea of presumptuous or presuming. Can't even talk all
Presumptuousness.
presumptuousness. The idea of presuming or daring to presume is necessary to get to that point. And we're not talking about like just acting out of self-defense or something like that, but more along the lines of what Dane was suggesting in terms of the courage or bravery that's necessary in combat. So the one of the significant places that we came across courage previously, you might remember the chapter where we talked about the three treasures. And the first treasure was the treasure of compassion. And then it talks about the idea of compassion being the foundation or the base for courage. Do you recall us talking about this? And so the idea there, because it was bringing in this female imagery, was like the mother protecting the child. right? And we said, don't get between a mother and her child because it's going to bring out that kind of courage. Or we could say here, as it's translated, bravery, where she's going to do whatever it takes to protect her child. But it's driven from this act of compassion. And in the subsequent chapters to that, we saw the importance of compassion, especially as it's related to the ideas of battle and war. So here, um, we can see maybe more of the opposite side of that, where this bravery maybe isn't having that foundation of compassion, but more the idea that it is bravery from more of those like socially derived, like masculine traits that are supposed to be demonstrated as a man, right? That you're supposed to be brave, you're supposed to be courageous, but it's not necessarily connected on the masculine side with this idea of compassion. And so it can be something that can be presumptuous. It can be something that there's that daring, and maybe it leads to this ability to do things like killing, because there could be a high degree of certainty about, yes, this person in fact did this wrong thing. Yes, I know that this leader that's commanding me knows the right thing to do, and so forth. That gives us that confidence to move forward in those extreme actions of which there is no way to undo, right? Whereas the second line here is focusing more, I think, on that compassion based courage, like Dane was saying about somebody who's willing to go into a burning building to save somebody, right? There's that courage, but it's driven more by that compassion, which results in living as opposed to the kind of courage that results in having that kind of confidence or certainty about the right thing to do, and in this case, take extreme measures. You tracking with that? Okay.
Yeah, I've never thought about it that way, but it seems so clear when and obvious now that I've heard it pointed out. Like you think of a firefighter, obviously, like that's courage. That's like pure courage with compassion. Like that's just the example, I feel like somebody willing to do something like that for somebody else. And then somebody who's maybe going into the military, like on the battlefield, that's also the same courage, but it comes with like a side of courage with confidence, in that they might have to do something horrible or make a really hard decision. It's just interesting to think about it that way. I don't know.
Yeah. And it's more about the idea that the decision or the value judgment has already been made, right?
Yeah.
In the first case. And this isn't to say that in the sense of a warrior or a soldier or something like that, that there can't also be a compassion-based bravery involved with that, which is in fact, in a sense, where the Daodejing goes with the whole concept, where, it says we shouldn't treat war as like something to be celebrated, but we should treat it as a funeral. But they're saying that there are times when that needs to happen, but when it needs to happen, the side that approaches it from that compassion base is the one that it suggests is going to be victorious because they have a different way of looking at it. And in fact, because of that compassion base, might not be so quick to jump into it as well. So,
Yeah, I think they both are courage with compassion. One just comes with a side, you know?
well, and this is where it's making the distinction then that it's not just about military or non-military. It's not just about does somebody have courage or bravery. It's the secondary element, this qualifier that it adds of this idea of daring or presumptuousness, right? Is the courage associated with that or combined with that or not combined with it? When it's combined with it, it can have disastrous effects because it's coming with this idea of certainty, right? Whereas the other side, it's not based on that. It's based on just, in this case, more of that idea of the compassion, right? So there's an element that gets weaved into this question about bravery in the case of daring or presuming that is the thing that is in focus here, and how potentially dangerous or life-threatening that concept is. This idea that we know, or that we have certainty, or we have confidence that something is right or wrong, and that justifies extreme action.
I don't know if this is,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I don't know if this is intended in the text or not. Of course, it's kind of impossible to tell what's really intended most of the time. But another spin on this that comes to me is the one aspect of bravery, you might say, is being fierce, as in if there's an enemy, being willing to stand up to them, even if they're more powerful or scary or whatever, which is presumably in defense of something good. If there's not something good and worth preserving, then there can't really be an enemy worth fighting either. But there's also the bravery associated with being willing to be vulnerable. And this may apply more to like emotional situations than physical ones. But like if somebody hurts your feelings, do you see them then as an enemy to be hurt back, or are you willing to be vulnerable and just open up and reveal what's true for you and share how you're feeling hurt and be willing to show, I guess, weakness in that sense, and showing that you can be hurt. The sort of emotional vulnerability takes its own sort of bravery,
Mm-hmm.
as
Yeah,
opposed to making an enemy image out of someone.
sure. And I think that would come back to that idea of that courage or that bravery that's grounded in compassion, right? There's a reason you're trying to open up, because there's a concern for the relationship that needs to be mended, right? Somebody's crossed that line and maybe they didn't even know. And so you're opening up to show that what had happened in an attempt to try and maybe bring about a reconciliation. So yeah, absolutely. From all different kinds of levels, we could look at this. This is, true to form. In the Daodejing, they tend to use, a lot of hyperbole, so they take it to the extreme examples, right? So here, life and death can't get much more extreme than that. But it definitely comes into play in all kinds of other things, in terms of, personal relationships or business dealings or whatever, right? There's times when we find ourselves confident that we know the truth, and that justifies us doing something against or to somebody else. And there's times where, we're motivated by compassion to do the right thing, even though it's scary, right? So there's, and I probably shouldn't have even stated it that way, because when I say the courage to do the right thing, we're back in that idea of that certainty, right? So there's the courage to do maybe the vulnerable thing, or the attempt to mend, or work towards more of a life affirming, life giving goal, as opposed to something where we're confident in doing something that's maybe negative because we feel like we're on the side of right.
I was watching a podcast the other day, or listening to one. It was a video, but anyway, regardless, he was talking about, it's a psychologist, and he was talking about how charisma is really just authenticity and being brave in difficult situations, like being able to handle difficult situations. And I thought it was interesting. And I feel like this is tying into it a little bit, because if you're brave, then you have the courage to be yourself, and you also have the ability to handle difficult situations. So this is just making me think about that a little bit, and I thought it was interesting.
Yeah. Well, let's see where this goes then. So of these, one is beneficial and the other harmful. And we think, okay, we can see this idea of benefit and harm in terms of course, living versus dying or killing in this case. But what's interesting here that is not at all obvious from the text is there's a pair of words that are being used here. The one for benefit or profitable, which is li, and harmful, which is, I believe that one is hai. These become kind of a key word pair and during the time that the Daodejing is being composed. So to give a little bit of the historical context here, the beginning of all this discussion about Tao's and what is the right way to go gets kicked off with Confucius. And Confucius is very much concerned about, again, the context being the Warring States period, how do we resolve these difficulties? How do we get out of this chaos, this mess? And for Confucius, it's very much about there is a way that we have structured society that the sage kings of old have determined, and it works when everybody follows. So there's a tradition, and what we have to do is get everybody on board in following this traditional way of doing things. And if they do that, then everything will be fine.
Easy,
Well,
right?
yeah, of course. And so as time progresses, you have other thinkers out there that start to ask the question, well, how do you know that that's the right tradition? Because there could be other traditions. Why aren't those right? What makes this one that you're suggesting, from the Zhou dynasty, that somehow they inherited this way of doing things that is the right way that we should all follow? And so you end up with a couple of different folks that bring up ways to answer that. One of them is a guy named Mo, and his school of thought becomes known as, he's Master Mo, so Moza becomes a school of thought in a sense. And he says, to answer that question, we have to go outside of the tradition if we're going to have some way of qualifying it. And he's a bit more like a utilitarian. And what he says is, does the tradition, is it profitable if we follow it, or does it cause harm if we follow it? So it's the same two words that we're seeing right here. And this becomes then his way of pushing back on the Ruist, which are the people who follow Confucius. And in that sense, they're saying we have to justify or correct or amend tradition based on this criteria of benefit versus harm. And then you have Mencius, which is a defender of Confucianism, that says, no, the way that we can know that the Confucian tradition is correct is because in our hearts, we naturally have this inclination that can determine the right way to go. And it's only because our heart's getting corrupted by cultural influence that if we can be clear of that and get back to the more natural flowing and functioning of the heart, then it becomes obvious that the Confucian way is the correct way. And it's in this context is where the Daodejing is coming together. So it's curious when we look at this particular line, is this a reaction either in a positive way or a negative way to the Moist perspective that we evaluate things based on profit or harm or benefit and harm? So here we've got two directions that we're looking at in terms of courage, either with or without this idea of daring or this presumptuousness. One leading to one enabling the idea that it can result in death, and one enabling a way that can result in life. Here, I think he's making the association of benefit with life and harm with death or killing. So it's interesting if we think of the Tao, it's coming from the perspective of looking to the way that things are as a way of determining what would be the most and essentially beneficial way of moving forward, is essentially using the same kind of argument, right? It's saying that how do we evaluate these things, it can't just simply be human valuation. We need to somehow have some kind of cue from the way things are to figure out what this looks like. And this is a tough one because if we look at nature, we can't always say, well, killing is always wrong, because things eat each other, right? All life depends on life, whether it's eating other plants that are living or eating other animals that ate the plants that are living. So there is no possibility of life existing without feeding on life, which is kind of a difficult paradigm to say that killing is wrong always, because otherwise life couldn't exist. So does this then become a way, like how would we, in a sense, use nature to try and justify the position of what type of bravery we should use? And so this benefit versus harm still is coming back to a bit of a socially constructed value, right? Now, we could say that our socially constructed value of valuing life over death is rooted in more of a naturalistic, built-in, evolutionary psychology desire to live, and everything has a desire to live, and so therefore it's appropriate to act in such ways that you will live. And that might be one of the ways that you can get there, but it's not a direct, easy map that you can make. It's still not clearly laid out from looking at nature what is the right thing to do in terms of, do we act with presumption that we are on the side of right, or do we act without presumption that ends up, potentially on the side of life? And so what I would say here is, because of that ambiguity, the distinction with those first two lines is with this idea of certainty. So if we look at nature and we can't even tell what the right thing is, like it's not an easy map between our values and what we see in nature of what the right or wrong thing to do is, how can we have certainty? And this is maybe a big thing within the Taoist tradition, is there's this skepticism about certainty, right? That we can't ever know everything about anything. We always have partial information. We always have information from a particular perspective that is incomplete. So how would we be so presumptuous to act as though we had all the information? So I think that's the direction that is starting to be wrestled with here, is in the larger question of what is the appropriate Tao between the different schools that are arguing with each other. One of them is trying to argue for this idea of benefit versus harm as a criteria. But how do we even answer that question, right? So it continues and says, considering what the heavens dislike, who knows the reasons? Right? How do we answer this, right? And it says, therefore, the sage finds it difficult. And so I think the direction that this is taking is trying to say that the underlying idea, what's being essentially vilified in those first two lines, is the question about dare or presumption, right? Because it has to do with a level of certainty that makes possible a certain way of acting. That, as the text is unfolding here, it's really bringing in the question, how can you ever think that you know? And this is where you kind of get to that idea of presumption, right? How could you be so presumptuous to think that you are so clear on the situation that you could go as far as actually killing somebody of which there is no going back, right? Versus more of this epistemological humility, the recognition that I don't know everything, but I can still act from a sense of compassion. And if my bravery is coming from that sense of compassion, I can do my best at trying to do things that are going to work towards life. And that might not always be, we can't always know until after the fact. We can see kind of how things have unfolded. And even then, it's hard to know because where do you put the beginning and the end of the story in terms of trying to make that evaluation? So you remember the story about the farmer who lost the horse.
I love
First,
that story.
like, yeah, first it seems negative, then it seems positive, then negative again, then positive again. And it really depends on where you bookend it, right? Say, oh, well, the story starts here and it ends here. Now we can make an evaluation. But the problem is the story doesn't actually have a beginning and an end when we're thinking about, the story of our world. So there's no way to ultimately come to that evaluation. We just have to do the best with what we can based on how well we can read and understand how these patterns are working, right? So one of the benefits, I think, of the Tao Te Ching and kind of Taoism in general is it doesn't prescribe the particular thing. It's giving you more of a methodology for a sense of how to read the situation because every situation is going to be a little bit different. No two situations can ever be the same. And so your ability to have a clear view of what's actually before you and an understanding of how these patterns function is going to help you understand what the particular path forward is in terms of what do I do in this particular situation. This is the goal with Taoism. So it's more of a prescription of um, or a methodology, right? Rather than a list of here's what you do, here's what you don't do.
I'm
So,
glad it got to this point because on the last slide, I was thinking, well, how do we know anything? Which is kind of what this is saying. Like, if we don't know which way is better, then how do we presume to know like literally anything?
right.
And then at the beginning, we were talking about, well, they have to have bravery to make these hard decisions. And I was thinking, well, how do they know that that's the right decision even? Like, how did, and who are they to say? I don't know. It just seemed like there was no answer.
Well, and
I
this
feel
is
like there isn't. There is no
yeah,
answer.
this is part of the Taoist challenge, right? And why in many respects, especially from what happens from the official perspective of the Chinese government moving forward, why ultimately they're like, well, we can't go with this because this is going to lead to anarchy, right? This is going to be everybody trying to figure out, what's from their own perspective. So
Yeah.
I think that the thing that the Taoists are suggesting is that there is no ultimate way to know, right? There is no objective written in stone thing that comes down from heaven that says, here's step one, two, three. And of course, this is the appeal of more of some of the different, more traditional religious approaches because they, pretend to offer that, right? And so it gives a confidence, it gives a security. And this really pushes back against that idea. And it can be very disorienting because, well, what do you mean we can't know? Right. But that doesn't mean there isn't anything that we do. So in the Zhuangzi, which is another early Taoist writing, one of the conclusions he essentially comes to with the same dilemma is to do something like language, for example. The Taoists are very suspicious about language because how can we know that other people have the same ideas when we're referring to particular words? How do we know that the words actually match up appropriately or create the appropriate divisions within, the nature of the world? Are those divisions legitimate or are they just convention that we use for navigating our world? And once we settle on one of those, we have selected a particular way of viewing or looking at things that excludes others. And we can't have any confidence that even with our language, that we have chosen the right thing. But ultimately, Zhuangzi says, well, there is no communication without language, and we can never know if any particular language is the correct one, or if there even is a possible way for language to be correct. But nonetheless, it allows us to communicate. And so, if we are born in America and we want to communicate with other people, it behooves us to learn English. Because if we said, well, English isn't perfect language, so I'm going to come up with a perfect language, that might be great, but nobody's going to be able to communicate with you, right? So you find a way to work within the constraints that have evolved in your cultural context with the added suspicion, so to speak, that we know that it's not the perfect language. We know it's not the perfect ways of looking at the world and that there's other perspectives. And so it allows us to have a little bit more of that humility of how we operate within a system, even though ultimately we have to pick a system knowing that the system's not perfect. It's
Makes
tricky.
sense. I don't think it makes anything easier.
Yeah. And I think that the bottom line here that's really important is the understanding that um, everything is essentially an imperfect understanding. And if we keep that in mind, that's going to allow us to have more grace for differences of opinion. It's to allow us to have less certainty about life altering decisions, and creating more of a space where we're trying to encourage the ability for life to flourish more than we're going to try and work on the other ways of doing things, because we know that we lack the certainty that this is the right thing to do if it's going to cause this level of destruction. So the sage even finds it in a sense difficult, right? Like there just isn't a way to have an answer to that. So then it continues and says, we're talking about, remember, Tian, heaven is another way of talking about nature. So this isn't like a personified deity or anything like that. So the Tao of heaven, the Tao of Tian, or the Tao of nature, like the way that things just kind of happen naturally, involves non-contention with adeptness at success. So it's going to present us now with a couple of paradoxes in which, if we think about the normal human inclination of how do we accomplish success, it requires that we control and that we manage and that we intervene, right? So here it's saying if we look at the natural world, that's not going on. There isn't a conductor. It's just doing what it does. And it is, and it's, if we're going to use the word successful, at doing what it does because it's there, right? Life is here and things are happening. There's a way that it does things without this idea of contention. And of course, they use water as a metaphor for this a lot, in terms of how water doesn't fight against things. It just goes around, over, underneath, whatever it needs to do. It just keeps flowing. Non-speaking with adeptness in response. So again, it's not even using language, right? there's a way that things just are happening that don't require even communication, but yet there's an appropriate response. Things go out and they come back. There's the seasons, there's these changes that happen, and it seems like everything's coordinated in such a way, but there's not even a language that's being used. Non-summoning with self-determination. So again, there's not a director that is determining things. Things determine themselves. And there is a broadness with adeptness in planning. So it seems like it covers everything, but when you really look at it, it seems like down to the smallest thing, things are kind of aligning themselves. So there's a context then, if we think about this idea of nature or Tian, in which life is happening. And if we look at that context is going to create either opportunities or shut certain things off from what we can and can't do. But also we can think of it in terms of what would be ways that are going to be more in harmony with it, or in which ways are we going to try and work against it, which will probably not be successful. So again, the Taoists are saying we need to observe, what are these patterns? How does life unfold? What is the nature of things? And it's in understanding that context that it helps us in particular situations to see what the path forward is, what the Tao is, right? What the way through it is. And so here we can't know with certainty answers of right and wrong or which way we're supposed to go. So whenever we act, it requires courage, but the courage to act isn't because we know, it's because we don't know, right? It's the courage to take certain steps to act without knowing for certain, but hopefully guided by this idea of compassion as opposed to just, this hard-minded certainty that has courage to do things that are potentially destructive. It's a lot in this chapter, really.
Yeah.
It gets at the core of a lot of things that I wasn't expecting when I dove into this chapter. Well, then the final part of this then is the celestial network, right? The web of heaven is vast and connecting without exclusion. So everything is connected in this big giant web, right? And everything has an impact on everything else. There's no way to act that doesn't have an impact on other things. And so again, we find ourselves in this question of, what should I do? What shouldn't I do? Because it's going to have this ripple effect that goes out. Well, here it's again, we're going back to that courage, but that courage with compassion that hopefully is going in the direction of leading towards life, as opposed to acting with a unwarranted confidence that we know what the right way to do is. And we've got a few minutes left. I'll just bring it back to see what kind of thoughts you guys are having.
I want to apologize in advance. There's some construction going on here, so hopefully there won't be too much background noise. But it seems to me there's a kind of circularity here because it's almost like if you start off with a sort of naive, childlike conviction that your way is right, like the way that children who are raised in a religious tradition just under a certain age they just kind of accept and believe what they're told. And then as if one starts from that kind of position, a sort of unwarranted certainty, and then evolves to a more objective position and seeing that things are relative and uh, and sort of recognizing, well, I believe this because this is what I was told, but how do I know it's actually true? And comes to a place of realizing that there really is no way to determine ultimate truth, and therefore you just have to make your best judgment and go with that. And often that means acting as if something was true, even if you can't be absolutely sure, because hesitation can be costly, especially going back to the beginning of in situations where bravery is required. If one person's life is at risk from another, one or more people's life is at risk from the actions of another person or people, and the only way you can save these people is by killing these people, that sort of situation requires decisive action. But if you hesitate, if you question, you might be ineffective. You might get yourself killed. You might get the people you're trying to save killed, and the real psychopath murderer goes free. So and even in less extreme situations, if you're not hesitant, if you're not sure, should I drive on the right side of the road? I don't know. Let me try over here. Like you realize ultimately you have to move forward. You have to act as if what you believe is true because of the consequences of doubting yourself. So it sort of comes full circle to where, okay, even though there is no ultimate uh, objective right way, we're still going to we're going to choose this way, and we're going to act and behave as if this is the right way. So it seems to come to kind of the same place, except that just having that awareness and the humility, I think is the difference. Having the humility, um, the humbleness, uh, like with scientific reasoning, you understand, we don't know it's true. We have to ask the universe, and we can always be wrong. We can discover something we think is true, and then later on find it's mistaken. Um, so there's a sort of open-endedness to it, but still, when something is established very strongly as scientific fact, it makes sense to move forward as if it's true. And but there's still an open-mindedness, a humility, and an understanding of that larger perspective, that we're making this choice to follow this because it's in our best judgment, but still being open to new information or the possibility of discovering that you were wrong, or in the case where you have to kill some people to save some other people, having the courage to live with that uncertainty, and sort of take on that that burden of guilt, so that other people can enjoy their lives fully. I remember something my grandpa said, who was a corpsman in the Navy corpsman. He landed at Guadalcanal, and one time when I was a teenager, I was all into this stuff. I asked him if he'd ever killed people, and he kind of he kind of got agitated a little bit, like it was a really strong, emotionally charged issue for him. And I remember him saying, "We didn't want to have to kill those men, but there was no other choice." And I could tell it wasn't something that he felt good about, or was like, something to be celebrated. He was still really upset about it deep down all those years later. But still, when it came to it, he made the choice, they followed through, and they were the ones that went home. So that, and therefore I got to be in the world. So um, that uh, there's an understanding that you have to do what you have to do, but also a humility um, that sometimes, I mean, that you can't ever be absolutely certain that you're in the right.
Yeah. And I think with a lot of the different points that you brought up, the key thing there is that because we don't have that certainty, it allows our perspectives to be updated, right? And I think that's the key thing, is when we come from the place of certainty, or that the past was right and we need to stick with that, then there isn't a way to update. There isn't a way to get new information to add to what we're doing. And in terms of the question of hesitancy, for the Taoist, there is this idea of how we develop skill to be more fluent and to have more of a second nature way of responding to things. Not that we can prescribe that in every situation where there's X, we do Y, but it's more of a way of honing our skills at being able to read the situation, to understand what's actually going on and how to navigate that, right? So there's examples of particular individuals that have particular skills, like the butcher that can just carve through the ox without having to even dull his knife, because he can just perceive, the spaces in between where his knife can go. Um, it's that type of adeptness, that skill that can be developed, not just for a particular thing, although there are specific skills that are necessary, but in life in general, of being able to be adaptive to situations, to be able to, in a sense, read the room and understand what's going on and understand human nature and those kinds of things. So, yeah, definitely some good observations. Anybody else have some thoughts before we close? All right. Well, if you've been watching this video and you would like to join us in our live discussion, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll receive an email weekly with our latest videos as well as the Zoom link for our live Friday morning discussion. Also, if you happen to be in the Southern California area where we meet in person, if you'd like to join us there. Thank everybody for being here and hope to see you next week.
Bye. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Jim.